Yeah, it's really interesting. So at the moment, some organizations should be able to look at how much they've spent with different suppliers, and in some circumstances they might be able to look at budget versus performance on a level, potentially with, for example, where it's man days or that type of unitary cost. I think the thing that comes to like cost overruns is also either that's going to be, as you said, a delayed process, or it's not going to, there's going to be no visibility of it at all. What's your opinion on the kind of split when it comes to services between unit cost-based work versus more kind of like milestone-based deliverables, in the sense that being kind of embedded in the services side of things, we're seeing more and more emphasis towards true milestones rather than more of the kind of time and expenses approach, where an organization is saying, I'm going to pay you A to know that B has been done. If I'm paying you unitary hours or unitary days, in some ways that's much easier for that to just, the scope of that and the cost of that to spread. How do you see that lining up in terms of the way that organizations are buying services?
I think I've seen a bit of both, and I do see these will continue because it really depends upon how mature your scope is. So if you are able to lock down the scope, then I guess the whole fixed pricing, capped pricing model makes sense, that I will not pay you more than this. And that becomes a pure milestone based approach. That's what I have seen today. And then wherever, let's say the requirement is more, I don't have a fixed scope, this is high level principle, all I need is resources who can adjust according to the work that I have given. So it's more resource based approach. Then you will see a unitary price comparisons. But from a procurement perspective, Johnny, I would, again, you analyze the unit price anyway, because you might be overcharging me even if I have a fixed scope and your overall cost is high. I would still compare your unit price with, let's say, my variable scope component. So from procurement perspective, I will see unit prices anyway. But from a contractual model, I guess, depending upon, am I able to fix down my scope? That's one factor. Second, for how long the service would run. So for example, if it's a 6-month clause, no matter, but if it's a multi-year clause, you might want to bring in some cost adjustments according to, let's say, the price increases because the salaries goes up, etc., etc. So a lot depends upon, I guess, how your business requirement is framing. But from cost comparison perspective, I think it will be unit price comparisons for either of the cases.
Yeah, and I guess so one thing about that is whether you're measuring, days delivered, and against when that's happening, or whether you're measuring deliverable milestones. If you're actually measuring it and you're actually capturing that effectively, then you are able to look at trying to prevent those cost overruns, or actually be alerted in real time to when cost overruns there's a risk of that, or it's actually already happening. Procurement and the buyer and the supplier can be made aware of that in kind of real time. I think the other thing that you mentioned, which was quite interesting, was how well can you nail down the scope? And I think that's where there's some really interesting use of AI within the market starting to come out now, to look at helping buyers and stakeholders actually define scope in the first place, and actually also collaborate with suppliers, with groups of suppliers, to actually refine that scope, because the buyer's not necessarily going to be a subject matter expert on the particular service that they're buying. That's a really fascinating area, because the more you can define it, the more you can measure it, the more you know up front, the more you can price it effectively. But there's also that kind of incremental approach, where almost like sprints, where we see a lot of project work might even go through a scoping phase initially before the rest of the project is built out from that. So it feels like whatever happens with services, there's always going to need to be a level of flexibility.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, the sprints approach makes sense. I haven't seen the AI-based solution. That'll be a first for me if that happens, because services scope is actually really tricky to baseline. But the sprints approach makes great sense to me. And just a caveat though, in terms of As a buyer, I would always expect for me not to be exposed towards any cost increments. So I've seen some suppliers saying I can run X amount of sprints for Y amount of money, etc., etc., which is not, let's say, a true output-based approach. So at the end of the day, I just want my work done. If you take 10 sprints or 20 sprints, that's up to you. But for me, at least the scope that I'm providing you, you should be able to deliver that scope in and how many sprints you want. So I've seen some suppliers transferring the risk, because if I put it this way, the whole risk management aspect, we shouldn't be offloading that to the buyers completely, because otherwise then the suppliers just have no skin in the game to play with.